Claire Monroe, a compassionate waitress, loses her job at Harrian's family diner for giving leftover food to Jonah, a homeless boy. Despite her termination, she continues sharing meals with him and other hungry children, unaware her kindness is photographed and goes viral. The nation rallies behind her, trending #FeedWithLove. The president, moved by her selflessness, announces the Claire Monroe National Food Security Initiative. As Claire's story unfolds, she faces job rejections, but remains steadfast, sparking curiosity about how her quiet acts of kindness will reshape a nation's conscience. What happens next? Inspired by Claire's story? Join our journey to share tales of kindness. Subscribe to my channel for more heartwarming stories that remind us of humanity's goodness. Support us by liking, sharing, and spreading love. Together, let's make a difference, one story at a time. Hit that subscribe button now. The rain hammered down on the tin roof of Harrian's family diner, a small beacon of light in the heart of rural Kentucky. Claire Monroe, at 29, moved through her evening routine with a quiet grace, her hands wiping down the final table of her shift. The calluses on her fingers told the story of 5 years spent scrubbing dishes, balancing trays, and pouring coffee for truckers and locals alike. To the regulars, Claire was more than a waitress. She was a steady presence, a listener who remembered their stories and their sorrows. To her, they were a patchwork family, filling the gaps left by a life that hadn't always been kind. Each night after the last customer shuffled out, Claire swept the gravel lot behind the diner, gathering litter under the faint glow of a street lamp. She'd divide the day's leftovers, scraps of meatloaf, spoonfuls of gravy, among the stray cats that slunk from the shadows, their eyes glinting with cautious trust. These small acts were her secret, unnoticed by the diner's management, but vital to her sense of purpose. They were her way of ensuring nothing went to waste, of finding meaning in the grind. Her supervisor, Diane, didn't see it that way. Claire had overheard Diane's biting words. Too emotional. Not professional enough. The criticism lingered like a bruise, but Claire never argued. Her job wasn't about being admired. It was about serving, about easing someone's burden, even if just for a moment. That Tuesday night, as the storm raged, Claire glanced out the back door while shutting down the kitchen. A small figure huddled near the dumpster, barely visible through the rain-streaked glass. A boy, no older than 10, his hair matted and his clothes torn, shivered in the cold. Claire's heart twisted, a pang so sharp it drowned out the clatter of pots and the hum of the fridge. She didn't hesitate. Turning back to the kitchen, she found a tray of beef stew, still warm, destined for the trash. She filled a container, added a few fresh dinner rolls, and grabbed a plastic spoon. Stepping into the downpour, she approached the boy, her sneakers sinking into the mud. "Here," she said, her voice cutting through the storm's roar, soft but unwavering. "It's still warm." The boy's eyes met hers, a storm of hunger and distrust swirling within them. Claire set the container beside him, careful not to linger. "Eat," she said simply. "No need to thank me." She returned to the diner, rain dripping from her apron, unaware that a security camera had captured her act. To her, it was nothing extraordinary, just another moment of care, no different from feeding the cats. But to the boy, it was a lifeline, a rare spark of kindness in a world that had left him to fend for himself. The next afternoon, Claire arrived for her shift, her hair still damp from the morning's drizzle. Before she could clock in, Diane blocked her path, her face a mask of disapproval. "Management office. Now." Claire's stomach churned, but she followed, her sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. Inside, Mr. Harrian, the diner's owner, sat behind a cluttered desk, his eyes cold. A paused video flickered on a monitor, showing Claire with the boy. "Do you deny giving away food without authorization?" he demanded. Claire shook her head, her throat tight. "No, but," Diane interrupted, her voice sharp, "we have strict food safety protocols. You distributed food outside our guidelines. That's a violation." Claire's mind raced, grasping for words to explain. "He was just a hungry child," she said, her voice trembling with conviction. "I couldn't leave him out there like that." Mr. Harrian leaned back, unmoved. "That's not your call. We can't have employees deciding what happens to company property. You're terminated, effective immediately." The words hit like a punch, stealing Claire's breath. She stood frozen, waiting for a chance to defend herself, to remind them of her years of loyalty, her spotless record. But no one offered her that chance. The decision was final, made before she'd even entered the room. Numbly, she gathered her things, a lunch container, a worn dish rag, and walked out through the front door. Regulars she'd served for years glanced up, their eyes curious but silent, as she left the diner that had been her second home. 3 days later, the story erupted. A national broadcast aired, the president's voice solemn as he addressed the camera. Her name is Claire Monroe. If you think this action didn't deserve firing, write unfair. The words ignited a public outcry, thrusting Claire's quiet act into the spotlight. But Claire remained unaware, shielded from the noise. She hadn't told her mother, Margaret, about the firing. Margaret was recovering from heart surgery, her strength fragile, and Claire refused to add to her worries. Instead, she pretended to go to work, leaving the house each morning with a forced smile, only to spend those hours searching for a new job. At the local supermarket, hope sparked briefly. The manager, a man with kind eyes, seemed interested until he read her application. It says you were terminated for food safety violations. Care to explain? Claire's heart sank, but she told the truth, recounting the boy, the rain, the stew. The manager listened, his face softening, but his response was firm. I'm sorry, but we can't take the risk. The rejection was gentle, but it cut deep, echoing the unfairness that had upended her life. Claire walked home under a heavy sky, her thoughts tangled with questions. Why did doing the right thing feel like a punishment? And who would help the next hungry child she couldn't reach? By the end of a grueling week, Claire Monroe's hopes were fraying like the worn edges of her apron. 3 more businesses had turned her away, their polite rejections echoing in her mind as she trudged home. Her savings, already pitifully small, were slipping through her fingers, each dollar spent a reminder of how close she was to the edge. The weight of it all pressed against her chest, a quiet panic that she hid behind a determined smile. She couldn't afford to let her mother see her falter, not when they were already scraping by in the cramped, aging house they shared. That evening, as Claire stood at the kitchen sink, scrubbing dishes under the dim glow of a flickering bulb, her thoughts churned. She pictured the stack of unpaid bills on the counter, the job applications she'd filled out with meticulous care, and the faces of shop owners who barely glanced at her before shaking their heads. Her dreams, once vivid with possibility, now felt like distant stars, faint, unreachable, and fading fast. A soft tap at the window broke her reverie. Startled, Claire set down a plate and parted the faded curtain. Outside, shivering in the chilly night air, stood the boy she'd seen days earlier, scavenging behind the restaurant where she used to work. His thin frame trembled, his hands clutching a crumpled piece of paper like it was a lifeline. Claire's heart clenched at the sight of him, his hollow cheeks and wary eyes stirring memories of her own childhood, of nights spent wondering if her father would ever come back, if the bills would ever stop piling up. Without a second thought, she opened the door, letting the cool air rush in. I can't write, the boy said, his voice small but steady. But I remember you. His words carried a quiet gratitude that made Claire's throat tighten. She grabbed her jacket, stepped out onto the back porch, and sat beside him on the weathered steps. From her pocket, she pulled the last bread roll from her own meager dinner and split it in 2, handing him the larger half. They ate in silence, the only sounds the rhythmic chirping of crickets in the nearby field and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. For a moment, the weight on Claire's shoulders lifted, replaced by the simple comfort of shared company. What's your name? She asked softly, breaking the stillness. The boy hesitated, his gaze fixed on the ground as if searching for an answer in the dirt. Jonah, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then, as if the words had been waiting to spill out, he added, Mom's sick, Dad's gone. The confession hung between them, raw and heavy. Claire nodded, her heart aching with a familiar pain. She thought of her own father, who'd vanished years ago, leaving behind a trail of unpaid bills and unanswered questions. She saw the same hurt in Jonah's eyes, the same quiet resilience, and it stirred something deep within her. A fierce resolve to offer him what she'd never had, someone who cared enough to stay. You come back here whenever you need to, Jonah, she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. I don't have much, but we can always share. He looked up at her then, his eyes wide with something like hope, and for the first time that day, Claire felt like she'd done something that mattered. Unbeknownst to them, a black SUV idled across the street, its dark windows concealing a man with a camera. James Miller, personal driver to White House senior advisor Eleanor Thompson, adjusted his telephoto lens, capturing the quiet moment on the porch. The image of Claire and Jonah, sharing a single roll under the dim porch light, struck him as something rare, a glimpse of humanity in a world that often felt cold and divided. Inside the vehicle, Eleanor Thompson glanced up from her briefing notes, her brow furrowing as she noticed Miller's focus. "What are you photographing?" she asked, her tone sharp with curiosity. Miller turned, a faint smile tugging at his lips as he showed her the camera's display. "Something worth seeing, ma'am," he replied. The image showed Claire's gentle expression as she handed Jonah the bread, her own hunger forgotten in the act of giving. Thompson stared at the photo, her usual composure softening. She saw not just a moment, but a story, one that could resonate far beyond this small town. The next morning, an anonymous post appeared on Twitter, the photo of Claire and Jonah accompanied by a simple caption, "Not all heroes wear capes. She just has an apron and a kind heart." The image spread like wildfire, shared across platforms, retweeted by strangers moved by its quiet power. Within 36 hours, it had been seen and shared over 1 million times, the hashtag #FeedWithLove trending nationwide. News outlets scrambled to uncover the identities of the woman and child in what pundits were calling America's conscience in one frame. The nation, weary from division and distrust, found in Claire's small act a spark of hope, a reminder of what kindness could do. But Claire remained unaware of her sudden fame. Her phone had been disconnected the day before, another bill she couldn't pay without a job. The internet would be next, and she braced herself for the inevitable. Instead of scrolling through the growing storm of admiration online, she spent her days walking from one business to another, her stack of job applications growing thinner with each polite rejection. Each no felt like a door slamming shut, but she kept moving, driven by a stubborn refusal to give up. That evening, Jonah returned, this time with 2 younger children in tow. They were small, their clothes tattered, their eyes wide with hunger and fear. Claire's heart sank at the sight of them, but she didn't hesitate. She took her own modest dinner, barely enough for one, and divided it into 4 portions, setting the plates before the children on the back porch. The act was instinctive, born of a compassion that ran deeper than her own survival. Her mother, watching from the doorway, frowned, her voice tinged with worry. "You won't have enough for yourself, Claire," she said, her hands twisting in her apron. Claire managed a small smile, though her stomach growled in protest. "I'll manage," she said softly. "I always have." As the children ate, their quiet gratitude filled the air, and Claire felt a fleeting sense of purpose. She didn't notice the unusual number of cars passing by her street, their drivers slowing to peer at the modest house. "Do you know those people?" her mother asked, stepping onto the porch with a puzzled frown. Claire shook her head, confusion flickering in her eyes. "Maybe they're lost," she said, brushing it off. The idea that her small act of kindness had captured the nation's attention was unthinkable. Across the country, the photograph had made its way to the highest office in the land. In the Oval Office, Eleanor Thompson placed the image on the president's desk, her voice steady but insistent. "Sir, I think you should see this," she said. The president studied the photo, his eyes lingering on Claire's worn apron and Jonah's trusting gaze. For a long moment he was silent, the weight of the image sinking in. "Who is she?" he finally asked. "We're finding out, Mr. President," Thompson replied. "But more importantly, what she did cost her everything." The words hung in the air, a quiet challenge to act on what they'd seen. 3 days after Claire lost her job, the nation tuned in for the president's scheduled address on economic initiatives. Viewers expected the usual policy points, the predictable partisan rhetoric. But midway through the speech, the president set aside his prepared remarks, his eyes locking onto the camera with a sincerity that caught even his aides off guard. "Today," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want to talk about someone who holds no office, who has no fortune, just a heart that refuses to turn away." The teleprompter, still displaying economic statistics, went ignored as he spoke from memory, his words raw and unscripted. Her name is Claire Monroe, he continued, and she gave what little she had to a child who had even less. The nation leaned in, captivated by the story of a woman who, in her quiet struggle, had reminded them of what it meant to be human. In the heart of a modest American town, Claire Monroe navigated the worn linoleum floors of Harrian's family diner, her apron bearing the smudges of a long shift. Her brown eyes, soft yet piercing, held a quiet empathy that lingered with every customer she served. Beneath her calm exterior, though, was a heart heavy with unspoken worries, not for her own struggles, but for the world beyond the diner's fogged-up windows. On a chilly evening, as she cleared a table littered with crumpled napkins, her gaze caught a small figure hovering near the entrance. Jonah, a boy no older than 10, stood with his shoulders hunched, his hands buried in the pockets of a jacket too thin for the autumn air. His hunger was palpable, a silent plea that gripped Claire's chest like a vice. Without hesitation, she gathered a portion of leftover chicken and mashed potatoes into a to-go container, her hands trembling as she stole glances toward the kitchen, wary of her manager's watchful eye. She stepped outside, the cold biting her skin, and pressed the warm container into Jonah's hands. His eyes, wide with astonishment, met hers, and for a moment the world felt a little less heavy. For Claire, it was an instinct, a reflex born of compassion. But it was a choice that would shatter her life and spark a movement. The next morning, Claire's world crumbled. Her manager, a man whose scowl seemed etched into his face, summoned her to his cluttered office. His voice dripped with disdain as he accused her of stealing food for a homeless child. Claire stood still, her pulse racing, but her thoughts weren't on her own fate. They drifted to Jonah and the countless others she'd no longer reach. She nodded, her voice trapped in her throat, and walked out with only her purse and a gnawing sense of loss. Days later, the consequences deepened. Unable to pay rent, she lost her tiny apartment, a sanctuary of thrift store finds and faded photographs. She retreated to her mother's small home where the air smelled of old books and lavender, and the walls seemed to hold decades of resilience. Yet even in her own hardship, Claire's spirit remained unbroken. When neighborhood children, their faces gaunt with hunger, knocked on her mother's door, Claire didn't turn them away. She split her own sparse dinner among them, her stomach protesting as she offered smiles and gentle words. Her mother watched from the doorway, her eyes glistening with a mix of pride and quiet despair. Claire's story, like a pebble dropped in still water, began to ripple. A local news report caught the nation's attention, and soon her act of kindness was a flame in a darkened room. Across America, people gathered around their screens, their hearts stirred by a woman who had given everything and expected nothing. In the Oval Office, the president read a briefing about Claire, his jaw tightening as he absorbed her sacrifice. Her story wasn't just news, it was a challenge to the nation's moral compass. That morning, he dialed her number himself. Claire, cradling a chipped mug at her mother's kitchen table, nearly dropped the phone when she heard his voice. Her hands shook as he spoke, not of her pain, but of her courage. She didn't plead for help or rail against her fate. Her voice, soft and unsteady, carried only worry for the children she could no longer feed. Moved by her selflessness, the president announced the Claire Monroe National Food Security Initiative, a nationwide effort to distribute surplus restaurant food with care and dignity. His voice grew firmer with each word, and as he spoke, millions felt the stirrings of hope. The response was electric. Social media ignited with praise and pledges, while newsrooms scrambled to keep up with a story that defied their usual cynicism. In homes across the country, families exchanged glances, their hearts swollen with wonder and unease. How had kindness become so scarce that it demanded a national spotlight? An hour later, Good Morning America arranged a moment that would linger in Claire's heart forever. Lured to the local library under the guise of a job interview, Claire sat nervously, smoothing her faded sweater. When the video call connected, the host's smile radiated warmth. "Claire, someone wants to speak with you," she said. The screen split, revealing the president, his eyes kind but resolute. "Meow," he said, a playful echo of a lighter moment, now a tribute to her grace. Tears spilled down Claire's cheeks as he honored her, not as a saint, but as a beacon of what humanity could be. "Sir," she whispered, her hand trembling over her mouth, "I just did what felt right." His reply was steady. And that's why we're here, because what should be common has become rare. Claire's life transformed in a heartbeat. 6 humanitarian organizations extended invitations, eager to harness her compassion. A vocational school offered a full scholarship, seeing in her a spark of untapped potential. The Unsung Heroes Foundation bestowed a special award, and a crowdfunding campaign for her and her mother's housing soared to $50,000 in its first hour. But not all reactions were warm. Hergen's family diner reeled under a torrent of outrage. Boycotts loomed, and their social media pages became battlegrounds of public scorn. By dusk, the owners issued a stilted apology, offering Claire her job back with a raise. She read it quietly, her expression unreadable. When reporters descended on her mother's home, their voices overlapping in the twilight, they pressed for her thoughts. Claire's response was simple. I don't need apologies. I just want that boy to have dinner every night. Her words silenced the crowd, a quiet prayer in a world of noise. Then came a discovery that deepened the nation's reverence. The diner's security footage, now in the hands of journalists, revealed a fleeting moment. After giving Jonah the food, Claire had reached into her purse, her fingers grazing her bus pass, her lifeline to work, to errands, to freedom. She slipped it into Jonah's pocket, along with a few crumpled bills, before returning to her shift. The act was so subtle, so instinctive, it might have vanished into the ether. But now it was a testament to her soul. Claire became more than a fired waitress. She became a symbol of relentless, unspoken love. Politicians clamored to tie themselves to her story, their words polished but hollow. Celebrities lent their voices, their platforms amplifying her name. Brands dangled endorsement deals, sensing profit in her purity. Yet Claire remained unchanged, still sharing her scraps, still speaking softly, still placing others' needs above her own. One evening, as shadows stretched across her mother's porch, a reporter asked if she harbored anger. Claire paused, her gaze lingering on the cracked sidewalk. Anger takes energy, she said, her voice a gentle murmur. I'd rather use that energy to help someone else. Those words, raw and wise, became the pulse of her story. They echoed in headlines, resonated in posts, and settled into hearts. Claire's tale wasn't remarkable because it was singular. It was remarkable because it reminded a nation of what it had lost. Kindness, not as a spectacle, but as a quiet daily act of grace. 1 month after the president's speech echoed through the nation, Claire's world had shifted in ways that felt both seismic and delicate, like a river carving new paths through stone. Her life, once defined by the quiet rhythm of her modest job and simple apartment, now pulsed with purpose, though she carried it with the same unassuming grace she always had. She turned down lucrative advertising deals and reality TV offers that flooded her inbox, their promises of fame hollow against the weight of her convictions. Instead, she poured her energy into a volunteer role with a nonprofit dedicated to feeding underserved communities. The Claire Monroe Food Security Initiative, named not by her choice but by those inspired by her, sprang to life in 50 cities. Restaurants across the country joined a carefully structured program to donate surplus food, ensuring it reached those who needed it most. Claire, ever steadfast, insisted the spotlight stay on the recipients, families, children, the overlooked, refusing to let her face or name grace any promotional materials. Her heart wasn't in the applause, it was in the quiet dignity of a shared meal. Jonah, the boy whose hunger had sparked this quiet revolution, felt the ripples of her kindness most profoundly. Once a wary figure crouched behind a dumpster, his eyes shadowed with distrust, he now stood taller, his spirit buoyed by possibility. Enrolled in a support program for homeless students, he found stability in ways he'd never dared imagine. His mother, long plagued by an undiagnosed illness, finally received the medical care she needed, her weary frame softening with hope as they moved into transitional housing. The promise of a permanent home glimmered on the horizon, no longer a distant dream, but a tangible path. Jonah's heart, once heavy with survival's weight, began to lighten, though he carried the memory of hunger like a scar, a reminder of the stranger who saw him when no one else did. Yet, amidst these sweeping changes, Claire clung to her rituals, anchors in a world that threatened to sweep her into its spotlight. Every Saturday afternoon, she returned to the same park bench, a weathered copy of The Little Prince tucked under her arm, a bag of sandwiches at her side. The neighborhood children knew her by now, their small feet pattering toward her with eager smiles, drawn not just by the food but by the warmth of her presence. She listened to their stories, laughed at their jokes, and offered them a space where questions weren't asked and judgment didn't linger. For Claire, these moments were sacred, a reminder that connection, not charity, was the root of her work. Her heart swelled with quiet joy as she watched the children, their laughter weaving through the park like a melody, each one a testament to the power of seeing someone as they are. On one such Saturday, Jonah sprinted toward her, his arms flinging wide as he enveloped her in a hug. The boy who once shrank from the world now radiated a quiet confidence, his clean hair catching the sunlight. "You're the only one who ever looked at me like I was normal," he murmured, his voice muffled against her shoulder, raw with a gratitude that pierced her. Claire's throat tightened, her hand gently ruffling his hair as she fought back the sting of tears. "That's because you are normal," she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion swelling in her chest. "Just a kid who needed a meal." In that moment, she saw not just Jonah, but every child she'd ever fed, every soul she'd ever reached. Each one a universe of potential waiting for someone to notice. The world moved on, as it always does. The media, once ravenous for Claire's story, chased newer headlines. Political debates shifted to fresher scandals, leaving her work to hum quietly in the background. But in a small church in her hometown, a photograph hung in a simple frame, capturing a moment that needed no explanation. Claire, sharing a piece of bread with Jonah. No caption adorned it, no logo claimed it, just a handwritten note beneath, scrawled in careful letters. "Sometimes you change an entire country just by sharing a piece of bread." The image was a quiet monument to a truth Claire lived by. Kindness doesn't need a stage to matter. Harrian's family diner, where this all began, couldn't weather the storm of its tarnished reputation. 6 months later, its doors shuttered, the building standing empty like a ghost of its former self. But the community, touched by Claire's example, refused to let it languish. A collective purchased the space, transforming it into a pay-what-you-can cafe called Claire's Place. Staffed by formerly homeless individuals learning culinary skills, the cafe became a beacon of second chances. Claire attended its grand opening, her presence brief but heartfelt, her smile warm as she watched Jonah, now a junior server, carry trays to elderly patrons with a confidence that made her heart ache with pride. When a local reporter asked how it felt to see her name on the building, she glanced at Jonah, her voice soft but firm. "Names don't matter," she said. "Connection does." She slipped back into the shadows, content to let others carry the light. Claire returned to her regular job, now as a program coordinator helping restaurants implement food recovery systems. Her salary remained modest, her apartment small, but her kitchen table was never empty. It became a haven for those with nowhere else to turn, friends, strangers, anyone who needed a meal or a moment of belonging. Each night, as laughter and stories filled her tiny dining room, Claire felt a quiet fulfillment, a sense that her life, though unremarkable to the world, was rich in ways that mattered. Her story wasn't about saving the world. It was about saving one boy. But that single act of kindness rippled outward, touching a society that sometimes forgets the power of small gestures. Claire's life was a reminder that heroism doesn't always wear a cape or command a headline. Sometimes it's just a woman on a park bench sharing a sandwich and a smile. Her actions whispered a truth we're all too quick to overlook. Kindness doesn't need an audience to endure, but it's always remembered by someone. In a world chasing grand gestures and fleeting fame, Claire showed that real change begins in the quiet moments. When we choose another's hunger over our comfort, another's dignity over our convenience, it arrives not with fanfare but in humble offerings, a container of beef stew, a shared roll, a fleeting moment of connection across divides. The greatest lesson from Claire's journey is this: decency doesn't wait for permission. Kindness doesn't need a policy. It asks only that we see our shared humanity and act, even when it costs us something. That choice, simple, unglamorous, and true, is the measure of what we hold dear. Claire and Jonah's story isn't just theirs, it's ours, made meaningful by every quiet act of goodness we choose to offer.